Anger has always been present in human history, but in the Bible it appears with a much greater weight than a simple emotional outburst. The ancient Hebrews saw anger as an inner force that could transform anyone, even the calmest, into someone capable of unthinkable acts. It was a feeling capable of destroying entire families and causing ruptures that lasted for generations. Therefore, understanding anger was not just an emotional issue, but a spiritual one. Today, this same force continues to act in our modern lives. Anger is one of the 7 deadly sins because it transcends the realm of emotion and becomes a force that governs actions, words, and decisions. In the biblical world, it was a constant risk, especially in small communities where any emotional outburst could generate conflicts that spread rapidly. The Bible does not treat anger as something occasional, but as a red alert for the human heart. Those who did not guard against it ended up being dominated by it. Scripture shows this repeatedly. When we observe anger in the historical context of the first century, we realize that it was deeply linked to a sense of honor. A small offense could be interpreted as public disrespect, and anger arose as an attempt to restore dignity. Jesus confronted this mentality several times, teaching that true strength lay in self-control. This shocked the culture of the time. After all, retreating was seen as weakness, but he taught the opposite. The strong one is the one who masters himself. The Bible also reveals that anger rarely appears all at once. It usually stems from accumulated frustrations, silent comparisons, and unresolved wounds. Therefore, anger has always been seen as something deeper than a difficult temperament. It is a sign that something broken within us is seeking to explode outward. And when it explodes, it doesn't ask permission, it simply destroys. In this video, we'll journey through the biblical, cultural, and spiritual context to understand how anger was perceived in antiquity, and how it continues to be one of the most dangerous forces in human behavior today. You'll discover how it is born, how it grows, and how it has been portrayed in stories that shape the entire Judeo-Christian tradition. And in the end, you'll understand what the Bible truly teaches about mastering this inner storm before it takes over everything. In the biblical world, anger was not simply seen as a loss of patience. It was associated with an inner state of fervor, almost like a fire rising from the chest to the mind. The Hebrews called this feeling charaf, something that burned from the inside out. Therefore, anger was treated as a spiritual force, and not just an emotional one. It had the power to destroy honor, break alliances, and ruin someone's reputation in minutes. It was too dangerous to be ignored. Jewish culture deeply valued honor and self-control, and anyone who lost their temper was seen as unstable. Uncontrolled anger was a sign of spiritual immaturity. In fact, in Proverbs, the angry man is described as someone without walls, meaning vulnerable to all kinds of emotional attacks. There was no praise for those who exploded, only warnings. Anger was synonymous with loss of self-control, and this was considered a serious character flaw. Body language indicating anger was widely recognized. Heavy breathing, a fixed gaze, a clenched jaw. These signs were interpreted as dangerous because they showed that the person was already overcome by impulse. In the ancient world, conflicts arose quickly, and a moment of loss of control could turn into tragedy. Therefore, wise men taught that controlling anger was a matter of community survival. It could disrupt peace, generate violence, and divide families. Another important point is that anger in the Bible is always presented as disproportionate. Even when it starts for a small reason, it grows like an avalanche. And it doesn't matter who is affected. When anger reigns, it doesn't choose targets logically. The person loses their composure and begins to act impulsively, not with discernment. This explains why so many biblical characters made disastrous decisions when they were angry, including leaders and kings. Today, the definition is almost identical. Anger is the same force that explodes, hurts, and then regrets. The difference is that now it appears in modern forms: digital arguments, sudden impulses, exaggerated reactions to minor setbacks. But the structure is identical to that of the ancient world. The Bible offers this profound insight because it understands that anger is a natural human reaction, but if left unchecked, it quickly transforms into emotional, spiritual, and relational destruction. In the first century, anger was a much more visible part of daily life than it is today. Villages were small, everyone knew everyone else, and any disagreement spread quickly. Conflict started over the smallest things: disputes over water, planting space, animals escaping into a neighbor's field. This intense coexistence strained emotions. When someone lost control, anger became a spectacle and left deep scars on the community. The rural economy also fueled tensions. An unfairly divided harvest, a late payment, or an unjust negotiation could ignite the anger of an ordinary man, and since there were no accessible courts or quick mediation, much was resolved by shouting. Anger became an emotional weapon to command respect. This made temperamental people feared, not admired. Everyone knew that an angry man could become a problem for the entire village. In family relationships, anger was even more explosive. The concept of family honor was strict, and any attitude considered disrespectful could generate arguments that lasted for days. Parents got angry with children, siblings competed for attention, couples argued intensely because the home was a center of authority. Anger was seen as weakness, but it was so common that many already lived in silence to avoid conflict, creating a cycle of constant tension. There was also the figure of the choleric man, frequently mentioned in ancient texts. He was the type of person incapable of controlling impulses, someone who would explode quickly and regret it afterward. This individual was described as unstable, dangerous, and emotionally unpredictable. Such people had difficulty maintaining friendships, businesses, or social standing. Jewish wisdom taught that living with someone dominated by anger was like walking with an armed madman. Anger also manifested itself in conflicts between groups, especially between Jews and neighboring peoples, or between internal factions. Small insults turned into fights that lasted for years. This scenario helps to understand why Jesus emphasized self-control, peace, and meekness so much. In a world so inflamed by daily tensions, controlling anger was not just a spiritual virtue, it was a practical necessity. And this reality remains very similar in our time. The story of Cain and Abel is the first great portrayal of anger in the Bible, and it is presented early on to show the gravity of this feeling. Even before the violence, the text reveals an inflamed heart that doesn't know how to deal with frustration. Cain doesn't explode immediately, he simmers his anger in silence. It's the perfect portrait of an emotion that accumulates until it loses control. The narrative makes it clear. Anger rarely starts big. It grows in the shadows. When God rejects Cain's offering, he doesn't condemn him, but does something surprising. He speaks to him. God asks why his face is downcast and warns that wrath is at the door, ready to overwhelm him. This phrase is extremely profound in Hebrew. The image is of a wild animal crouching, waiting for the moment to attack. In other words, wrath is something external that wants to enter and control. God gives the warning before the worst happens, but Cain ignores it. Cain allowed his anger to cloud his vision. Instead of looking at his own mistake, he turned Abel into an enemy. Anger always does this. It changes the lens. The person no longer sees facts but threats. In the first century and today, the process is the same. An inflamed heart creates enemies where none exist and exaggerates situations until they become unbearable. With Cain, this distortion turned into violence. He didn't kill Abel simply out of anger. He killed because his anger had already taken the throne of his conscience. Another striking detail is that Cain calls Abel to the field, away from witnesses. This shows that his anger was not spontaneous loss of control, but planned anger. It is the worst kind of anger, the kind that doesn't explode, but is calculated. Many ancient commentators say that this is the real danger of anger, when it is mixed with intent. The Bible doesn't soften this. It shows that anger, when nurtured, has the potential to destroy even those who should be loved. At the end of the episode, what remains is silence, guilt, and distance. Anger separates Cain from God, from his family, and from himself. He loses everything. This story exists not only to explain an ancient crime, but to show the pattern that continues to this day. Anger doesn't need weapons, it needs inner space. When it finds that space, It transforms ordinary people into versions of themselves they never imagined they could be. That's why the Bible treats anger with such seriousness. Anger doesn't only appear in the villains of the Bible. It also arises among the disciples, men who walked daily with Jesus. This shows that no one is immune. In multiple episodes, they argue about who would be the greatest in the kingdom, revealing internal tensions that were growing silently. These discussions were not lighthearted. They carried competitiveness, pride, and irritation. Jesus frequently interrupted these disputes before they escalated into larger conflicts. One of the most intense moments is when James and John ask for positions of honor beside Jesus. This request generated indignation among the other disciples, and the text makes it clear. The reaction was driven by anger. They were irritated because they felt surpassed. This episode reveals an ancient and modern truth. Anger grows when the ego is wounded. Jesus does not rebuke them for their ambition, but for the competitive spirit that was creating rivalry within the group itself. Another striking example is when Peter acts out of anger in Gethsemane. Faced with a threat, he draws his sword and cuts off a servant's ear. The gesture was not heroism. It was a lack of self-control. Peter allowed emotion to guide his action before reflection. Jesus does not praise his courage. He corrects him immediately. This episode shows how anger, even when it seems justified, still produces harm that goes against God's purpose. Impulsive anger never produces good decisions. The Bible also reveals moments when Jesus confronts the anger of the religious leaders. They were not reacting merely out of disagreement. Many reacted with growing irritation, fueled by pride and fear of losing social standing. This anger blinded them to their own errors and prevented them from recognizing the truth before them. Jesus responded firmly, but without being overcome by emotion. A clear contrast between destructive anger and righteous indignation. These episodes show that anger doesn't need external enemies. Human interaction is enough. The disciples had the best possible teacher, but they still struggled with internal impulses. This reveals that anger is less about circumstances and more about spiritual maturity. Jesus guided them toward a new pattern of behavior, controlling anger before it defined their attitudes, and this same instruction remains essential for us today. The Bible makes it clear that anger has an almost instantaneous capacity to destroy important relationships. It creates emotional barriers and transforms small disagreements into gigantic conflicts. In Proverbs, the wise man states that anger promotes strife, showing that it opens doors to arguments that don't need to exist. When someone is dominated by anger, the bond with friends, family, and colleagues becomes unstable and fragile. Trust disappears quickly. In the biblical context, impulsive words were seen as dangerous tools. An insult uttered in the heat of anger could ruin family alliances that had lasted for generations. Honor was an enormous value at that time, and any aggressive speech was interpreted as a direct attack. This generated deep ruptures, often impossible to repair. The social impact of anger was so great that the entire community could suffer when someone exploded. Anger also creates a difficult emotional cycle to break. The angry person regrets it, but the damage is already done. In the biblical world, requests for forgiveness were not simple. They required rituals, witnesses, and lengthy processes. Therefore, the wise insisted that controlling anger was more intelligent than patching up its damage. The consequences of an emotional outburst were far greater than the momentary anger that caused it. Another problem is that anger distorts perceptions. It makes a person interpret neutral gestures as attacks and good intentions as threats. This distortion affects relationships because communication becomes suspect. In the first century, where families, work, and faith were intertwined, this caused chaos. A person dominated by anger could isolate themselves or alienate important allies, believing that everyone was against them. Anger creates imaginary enemies and destroys real alliances. Today, this pattern remains the same. Family feuds, digital blockages, impulsive arguments, and abrupt breakups are modern expressions of the same old problem. Anger destroys because it acts first and thinks later. It closes doors that are difficult to reopen and hurts those who didn't deserve to be hurt. The Bible treats anger as destructive because it breaks what takes years to build. And when a relationship breaks down because of anger, both parties lose. The Bible speaks extensively about explosive anger, but its most serious warning is about silent anger. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't break anything but grows hidden. This type of anger is mentioned in texts that speak of bitterness, resentment, and a hardened heart. In the biblical world, this was seen as internal corrosion. It doesn't need noise to destroy, it just needs to be kept hidden. Silent anger transforms a person from within before others realize it. Silent anger is born from small accumulated disappointments. A misinterpreted gesture, a harsh word, a frustrated expectation. At first it seems insignificant, but it accumulates like dust in an ignored corner. The Hebrews called this a heavy heart. It's not fury, it's heaviness. This type of anger is more dangerous because it is rarely recognized. The person thinks they are just upset, but they are nurturing a root that grows slowly. The problem is that silent anger changes the way a person sees everything around them. It distorts motivations, creates suspicion of intentions, and leads to negative interpretations. The heart begins to exaggerate small problems and accumulate resentments. The Bible describes this as a root of bitterness, an expression that indicates something that grows underground, out of sight, until it becomes impossible to uproot. It is discreet, but deep. In the first century, this type of anger was especially feared because it fueled revenge. People who harbored resentment for months or years planned belated reactions that caught the community off guard. It was a cold, calculated anger that didn't stem from impulses but from cultivated grudges. This behavior was seen as spiritually poisonous because it caused the person to distance themselves from God while appearing to be at peace. Silent anger creates masks. Today, this pattern is increasingly common. People accumulate irritations without talking about them, hold grudges, and live with small annoyances until they explode disproportionately. Silent anger destroys more relationships than visible anger because the other person never knows what's happening. That's why the Bible insists so much on dealing with anger early. What is not resolved at the beginning becomes a prison later. The Bible never ignores anger. It teaches us to manage it before it makes decisions for us. The first principle is self-control, a spiritual fruit repeated in several passages. For the Hebrews, controlling oneself was a sign of true strength. They affirmed that the man who masters his own spirit is stronger than the one who conquers cities. This shows that the real battlefield is not outside, it is within the heart. Another central teaching is the power of a gentle answer. Proverbs states that a gentle word turns away wrath, showing that anger loses its power when it encounters no aggressive resistance. In the world of the first century, where honor was everything, responding with gentleness was a radical act. It was choosing not to engage in the game of provocation. This practice was not a sign of weakness, but of emotional maturity. Those who respond calmly control the environment, not the other way around. The Bible also teaches us to resolve conflicts before anger matures. Jesus said to reconcile quickly with one's brother, even before presenting an offering at the altar. This detail shows that, for him, emotional stability came before religious appearances. Reconciliation was not an option, it was protection. The longer someone carried irritation, the more difficult it became to untangle the emotional knot created by anger. Another strong point is the principle of not letting the sun set on anger. This isn't literal, but a powerful symbol. Don't let anger slumber within you. Don't give it time to take root. The ancients knew that anger grows at night, when the mind revisits offenses. Resolving things quickly was practical wisdom. This guidance is extremely relevant today because most modern conflicts escalate precisely when irritation is held back. Finally, the Bible presents the practice of meekness as a lasting antidote. Meekness is not passivity, it is strength under control. Jesus describes the meek as heirs of the earth because they do not react impulsively, do not engage in empty arguments, and do not let anger rule. This behavior protects relationships, decisions, and emotional health itself. Controlling anger is not repression, it is discipline, and this is the path to healing that the Bible offers. Anger continues to be destructive in the 21st century because the modern environment fuels constant triggers. We no longer live in desert villages, but in a fast-paced world, full of pressures, unrealistic expectations, and accumulated frustrations. Small setbacks take on enormous proportions because the mind is already overloaded. Just as in the past, anger is born when the heart feels threatened or ignored. The difference is that today it finds more fuel. Digital culture amplifies this problem. Quick messages, online discussions, and an excess of opinions create daily confrontations. Many vent their anger behind screens, believing it will have no consequences. But the emotion remains, intensifies, and returns to real life. What was once a face-to-face conflict now spreads through the virtual environment, affecting people who weren't even part of the initial discussion. The anger has become public and contagious. Furthermore, modern life generates a constant feeling of injustice. Queues, traffic, delays, comparisons on social media, and competition for attention. These small emotional frictions wear down inner balance. When a person is already emotionally fragile, any detail triggers disproportionate reactions. This is exactly what the Bible described. When the heart is full, anger needs very little to overflow. Today, this happens all the time. Another factor is the lack of emotional self-control. In the first century, discipline was taught from an early age. Self-control was a spiritual and social value. Today, many do not learn to deal with minor frustrations, which transforms common irritations into intense outbursts. The lack of internal boundaries is fertile ground for anger. When a person doesn't know how to name their emotions, they are governed. And anger always takes command first. Finally, we live in a society that normalizes irritation. Being explosive has become an identity for some. Being too honest has become an excuse for aggression. But the truth remains the same as in the Bible. Anger doesn't solve anything. It only destroys. It burns opportunities, hurts relationships, and leaves deep scars. The reason it remains so destructive is simple. It has operated the same way for millennia, and those who don't learn to control it end up repeating the same story from ancient pages. Anger runs through the Bible as a clear warning. What is not controlled internally destroys everything externally. From Cain's village to the tensions between disciples, we see that anger never appears alone. It arrives carrying frustration, wounded pride, and accumulated pain. Therefore, Scripture does not treat it as an occasional feeling, but as a force that can dominate the human heart if it is not guarded. And when it dominates, the fall is always certain. Throughout the video, we saw that anger is not a modern mistake, but a repetition of patterns that span millennia. The scenario has changed, but the behavior remains the same. People who don't deal with their wounds end up taking it out on the first target they see. Families break apart, friendships deteriorate, and decisions are made in the heat of the moment. The Bible shows this clearly because it recognizes the most fragile side of human beings, and the most dangerous one as well. But it also shows the way out. Self-control, quick reconciliation, meekness, gentle answers, and spiritual awareness are not just virtues. They are practical tools to prevent anger from taking hold of the heart. Jesus did not ignore human emotion, but taught how to redirect it. He showed us that there is strength in calmness and maturity in silence. It is not natural, but it is transformative. And that is how anger loses its power, when it encounters a trained heart. Anger continues to destroy lives today because many do not understand its root, nor recognize its signs. That is why in-depth Bible studies like this are so necessary. They show that the Scriptures do not only speak of ancient people, they speak of us. The same conflicts, the same reactions, the same dangers. Knowing this ancient wisdom is learning to identify inner storms before it is too late. If this content resonated with you, I invite you to follow the channel. It's not about numbers, but because here we explain the Bible with historical depth and apply each theme to real life, something almost no one does seriously today. This series on the 7 deadly sins is still only in its early stages, and each episode will expose a sensitive area of the human heart with clarity and truth. Following the channel guarantees you won't miss this journey of spiritual transformation and biblical understanding.